Hello everyone, and welcome to this lesson on writing skills, in particular a couple of tricky bits of punctuation and some sentence types today. You'll do it now if you haven't already completed it with me in the register. Is this? I would like you to identify the minor, simple, compound and complex sentences in this particular paragraph below. You can either highlight them in the correct colours on the worksheet that you've got in your Teams folder, or if you don't have access to that assignment sheet, then you can write out the sentences and label them correctly. If you need to pause the video to do this, then please do so. If not, just let it run on until you get to the next task. So here are the answers you could have had. A simple sentence starts us off: the Olympics would be a great addition to our city. Followed by a compound sentence. That one's got a conjunction in the middle, the word and I believe that Plymouth deserves a chance to show off its best side. A complex sentence has got to have a subordinate clause in it, so a little bit that wouldn't make sense if you put it by itself. So you've got one of those there, followed by another simple sentence, and then three minor sentences. A minor sentence is just a single word, perhaps a short phrase, but it doesn't quite form a full clause like a simple sentence does. And then we've got one more complex sentence to end with. It's important to remember when you're writing any piece of work, really, whether it's creative or whether it's not creative, if it's transactional, if it's a letter to persuade or it's an article or anything like that, it's always important to vary up your sentence lengths and sentence types, and these are the four main ones that you can use in your work, going from minor, which is obviously very short, a single word, up to simple sentences that say one thing, and then compound and complex sentences that are a little bit longer. The key difference between a compound sentence and a complex sentence is that a compound sentence is basically a balanced one. Both halves, either side of the connective or the conjunction, would make sense by itself, whereas a complex sentence, you'd always have one chunk of that sentence that wouldn't make sense by itself if you put it by itself. Okay, so there's a little bit of work on sentence forms. For the rest of this lesson today, we are going to work on a few tricky bits of punctuation, because I know from my classes, all of my classes actually, in 10 and 11, we need to brush up on our punctuation skills. And if you're watching this from a lower year group, then it's always important, it's always really handy to have a lesson like this every once in a while. You'll see there that our learning objective is to brush up on these skills so that we can write clearly and effectively. That's an objective for all of us. If you're in year 11, then you know that your GCSE exams that are coming up have got 16 marks at the end of it, and you will be wanting to pick up as many of those 16 marks as you can. Those of you in lower year groups, though, you'll obviously be building towards that sort of skill in the next few years, so it's important to keep these sorts of skills going. We're going to start today with the semicolon. The tricky semicolon isn't really that tricky when you realise that a semicolon basically replaces an and, or a but, or a nor, or a yet. Any one of those conjunctions that you use in a compound sentence could, most of the time, could be replaced by a semicolon. You've got an example here. That the lesson was going great, semicolon. The class had already figured out what a semicolon does. Now there could be a conjunction in there. You could have an and in there instead and it would still make sense. But in this case, I'm looking at picking up marks. I'm looking at impressing my marker by using a semicolon. You'll notice here, and you might want to pause the PowerPoint at this moment to read the text from the image on the right hand side. The person who's put this together has used the example of a man with hairy knuckles driving an ice cream truck, and that one gives you another little bit of information, a little bit of advice on using semicolons. But the advice is the same. Wherever you've got a compound sentence where you could use a conjunction like and, you could also use a semicolon in its place. And that's really the only place that we want to use a semicolon. The only thing you need to be aware of, or keep in mind, is that both halves of your sentence with a semicolon in need to be main clauses. That means that they should make sense on their own. So if we look at our example here, the lesson was going great, and then the semicolon, that first part in green there would make sense by itself. The second part, the class had already figured out what a semicolon does. Again, if you put that in a sentence by itself, it would work. So I want you to pause the video at this point, and on your worksheet, if you've got access to it, you should be able to see these three sentences. And remember, at the end of this lesson, I want you to submit these so I can mark them. You have a sentence about my mother being a talented artist, a sentence about a teacher, and a sentence about me, Mr. Ward. Now, each of these sentences could be rewritten so that you use a semicolon. You'll notice that the first one is actually two sentences, but it could still work if you figure out how to turn that into one sentence with a semicolon in the middle somewhere. Put the semicolon in the right place, and I'll join you for the second part of the lesson on colons afterwards. So you can see the answers here. For the first one, I took out the full stop between artist and her. Those two simple sentences are main clauses. They work just as well because they're related as a compound sentence with a semicolon in the middle. For number two, the word because has been dropped. Anything that starts with the word because would be classed as a complex sentence. It would be a subordinate clause. You can't really use with the word because without having a main clause to explain it. So I've dropped that word, I've replaced it with a semicolon, and because these two sentences or these two clauses are now main clauses, the semicolon works in the middle. And number three, we simply take out the conjunction but and we replace it with a semicolon. So hopefully you can see there that the semicolon works just to smooth things out in your sentences a little bit. You don't need to use too many conjunctions in between. You can swap your conjunctions out for semicolons. You shouldn't do it every time, but certainly a couple of times to use a semicolon when you've got a compound sentence with a conjunction in the middle would be very good. Or if you've got two simple sentences that are related to each other that are on a similar topic, then you can use them there. So the colon, it looks a lot like a semicolon, this one, but they actually do completely different things. So the first way, and the most popular way to use a colon, is at the start of a list. You've got a couple of examples at the top of the right hand side of the screen there. He was going to buy 3 things, and then a list of things he was going to buy: chairs, tables and utensils. Or John wrote, and then the colon, and then what he wrote after that. Or it can be used to emphasize short phrases or keywords within an idea. I always like to think of the colon in this sense as like an equal sign. Whatever comes before the colon on the left hand side is kind of explained or figured out by what comes on the right. Like this one here in the middle, number 2. They will not make it. The storm is too strong. They will not make it kind of sets you up to think, why won't they make it? What's going on? And the right hand side after that colon sets you up again, or it answers that question. The storm is too strong. Down the bottom you've got another really good example. That he was there for one person. Who is that one person? Oh, it's his mother. That's how a colon works. So again, using these rules, the rules that are on there, or the examples that are on the right there, have a look at these sentences, these examples, and see if you can put the colon in the right place. You might need to rewrite some of the words in these sentences in order for the colon to work. You need to make sure, especially if you're writing something that's got a list in it, that you don't use words like such as or like with your colon. Your colon should replace those things. Okay, so pause the video, have a go, and I'll see you back here for the last part of the lesson in 5 or 10 minutes or so. So you can see here our 3 colon tasks. Our first one, we've got rid of the phrase such as and replaced it with a colon. It's always important to remember that if you're using a colon in a list like that, the bit that comes before the colon needs to make sense by itself, just as our example does in the top right hand corner. John was going to buy lots of fun things would still make sense if you put a full stop after it, but the colon gives you the opportunity to then list a few of those things. Number 2 and number 3 work very similarly. We've got a phrase that kind of leads us into thinking what's going on, what's happening. The moment in number 2 that he had been waiting for. What is the moment? The chance to lift the cup. And then for number 3, his head of year was the one person that Harry didn't want to see coming down the corridor. So one side of that colon kind of answers the other side. You'll also notice in number 3 that I got rid of the words "it was" because they're kind of superfluous, they're unnecessary. I don't really need them in order to make the point that I'm trying to make there, so I've got rid of them. It's always good to use less words to say something than using more words. So hopefully you got those correct, and if not, go back and change them around, see if you can have another go at them. There are several other bits of punctuation that we could use in our work. There's a couple of examples here. Dashes. There are actually two types of dash. Did you know this? So there's a short dash called an N dash and a longer dash called an M dash, and they're named like that because the N dash is just about the length of a capital N when you type it, and the M dash is again just about the length of a capital M when you type it. These two are used in different ways in typed writing, but for handwriting we could really just take either of these dashes and use them in any of the ways that you see there on the left hand side of the page. I'm a big fan of a dash. I like to use a dash in my writing quite often. Brackets are another one. Brackets are an easy way to pick up marks in an exam, and they're an easy way to show whoever's marking your work that you're able to use things like subordinate clauses, that you're able to structure a sentence correctly with brackets in. And there are 4 different ways to use brackets on the right hand side there. If you'd like to have a go at using any of those, then you can do so in your extension task in a second. And remember, you can pause this video at any time if you need to take note of anything that's on the screen here. So finally, these are just general tips for any piece of writing that you produce, really. It's kind of considered by English teachers and people who mark English exams that 5 different types of punctuation used effectively and used regularly in a piece of writing would be enough to show that you've got control over a range of punctuation. That includes full stops and commas and apostrophes and things like that, but you should also think about a few extra ones on top of that to show sophisticated use of punctuation. You always need to keep in mind, as you're writing things, that you should be able to craft your sentences to give you the opportunity to use a semicolon or a colon. These things don't happen automatically. You need to think about how to lead your work into, for example, a short list or a compound sentence that allows you to use a semicolon. You'll notice at the bottom of your worksheet for today, if you have access to it, or if not, just listen to this next task, but you'll notice that there's an extension task based on writing some tips about how your year group could survive in lockdown. Now I want you to add that to the bottom of your assignment sheet, or if you're working on paper, please just write it out on paper, and I want you to focus on using as many different types of punctuation as you can in that work so that I can see it there, so that you've used a few different types. When I come to check in on your work, I'll have a look at your use of colons and semicolons as well, and I'll be able to correct any ones that you've got wrong. Alright? Have fun with it, guys, and remember I'm in the chat if you need me at any point in the lesson.